And this development can start as early as 2 weeks. So we're going to go into all the stages of prenatal development in just a moment. But when we talk about prenatal development, we're talking about the entire period prior to birth. So from the moment of conception until the end of pregnancy, which is around 40 weeks or 9 months. So the first stage of development in prenatal development, so again, this is before you're born, is called the germinal period. This period starts at conception and lasts until about 2 weeks of age. Okay, so during this time, this is when the zygote, which is a fertilized egg, okay, that's what we call it, it's developing. So there is a rapid cell division that's occurring. The zygote grows from only 32 cells to around 150 cells. And this is the germinal period. Okay. The second stage is the embryonic period. And this lasts from about 2 weeks until 2 months. So during this time, all of the vital organs and bodily systems start to emerge. They start to develop. So we're talking about the heart, the spine, the brain, the liver, and so on. And at this particular period, the embryo is extremely vulnerable, right? Because everything is developing. Sorry, I had to step away for a second because my dog was barking in the background. I didn't want you guys to hear that. Where was I? So I was talking about when all of the vital organs and bodily symptoms are starting to emerge. So during this embryonic period, the embryo is extremely vulnerable, right? So if anything goes wrong at this point or interrupts this stage of development, it can go terribly wrong, often resulting in a miscarriage, unfortunately. So this is a very critical period for a fetus, right? Or for the embryo, which is what we refer to it as at this point. And then the final stage of prenatal development is the fetal period. So this lasts from 2 months until the fetus is born, right? So this is when the muscles begin to develop, their bones begin to form. And of course, the fetus, grows in size. So their movements start to become stronger. This is typically when mom can start to feel the fetus moving and things like that. And then, of course, you have their brain cells are starting to multiply and they multiply significantly. They increase significantly during that final 3 months of the fetal period before they are born. Now, before the fetus is born, they go through what are called sensitive periods. So, this is where they're particularly sensitive to various stimuli or environmental factors around them. So, things that are happening inside of the womb, right? And there are several to consider that can affect the development of the fetus overall. So, mom and baby are, of course, linked through the placenta. This is how the fetus gets its blood supply, its nutrients, and, of course, is protected from the outside world, right? So a mother's nutrition is really of the utmost importance because if mom isn't eating healthy, then baby is not being provided with the nutrients that it needs to fully develop, especially when all of those bodily systems are being developed and things like that. If they are malnourished, if mom is malnourished, then the fetus is not getting the nourishment it needs to properly grow and develop. And especially if mom is underweight. So if the mother is underweight, this can cause a number of birth complications and neurological problems. So this is if mom, maybe has an eating disorder or is severely underweight for the entirety of the pregnancy. And this is why, things like you get weighed at every prenatal checkup. They need to make sure that you are gaining weight. When I had my daughter, I was very, very ill. I had a condition where you're basically extremely sick for the entire 9 months. You can't keep any food down, and so on. And I remember there being a point where my doctor said, all right, like we have to get food in you and you have to start gaining weight because now we're getting worried. Like now it's at a point where, the fetus, your daughter, could have some really detrimental effects if we don't take care of what is going on. So they had to put me on all kinds of crazy medications to basically force my body to keep food down. So a lot of medications they put chemo patients on and things like that to keep you from getting sick. So it's a really important thing, making sure that the fetus has the nutrients it needs. Otherwise, it can't grow and develop, right? Some studies have also suggested that the emotions that the mother experiences during pregnancy can have an impact on prenatal development. So, research has suggested that those moms who are anxious or really tense or very stressed out during pregnancy are likely to actually have a baby who is more irritable, right? Maybe they're hard to soothe, they don't sleep well, they don't eat properly, and things like that. And again, it's whatever. Hormones are being released when the mom is experiencing certain emotions or feelings. So if they're really stressed out, right, your body does release various hormones with that. If they're not sleeping as well, things like that. And this can affect, because remember, the placenta, things pass through it, it's permeable. So those hormones can also affect the growth and development of the fetus and can result in maybe a baby that is more irritable, right, than others. So the autonomic nervous system of the fetus is actually sensitive to those chemical changes. So that's what is causing, that change in the child after birth. So it's the autonomic nervous system that's being affected by the chemical changes that they get from mom's emotional state during pregnancy. Now, of course, this is probably not a surprise to anyone, but a woman's drug use during pregnancy can significantly impact prenatal development, even if they're legal drugs, such as pain pills, right? This is why doctors always want to know exactly what it is you're taking when you're pregnant. And most medications say if pregnant or breastfeeding, please contact a physician, because you need to look at the side effects of these pills and how they affect your system, because they could also affect the fetus as well. So many drugs, both prescription and recreational, are linked to birth defects. And unfortunately, quite often, or more often than not, this can also result in the infant being born addicted to the drugs that were being taken by the mother. And as an infant, when they're born, if that's the case, they go through really painful withdrawal symptoms and sometimes can even have lasting physical and or mental impairments from drug use. So this is a big environmental factor that can impact the development of the fetus. Nicotine use is another environmental factor that can detrimentally affect prenatal development. So, smoking while being pregnant can lead to a miscarriage or death of the infant. And if the fetus survives the pregnancy, it often, using nicotine while you're pregnant, often leads to premature births, or the infant having a low birth. And this is low weight birth. So they don't wear very much when they're born. This comes from their lungs typically not being fully developed, and they're not getting a lot of oxygen, they're not absorbing the nutrients, and so on and so forth. So that comes from if mom is smoking during pregnancy. And another factor is alcohol. So, the use of alcohol while pregnant can result in extremely dangerous effects on the fetus. There's, of course, something called fetal alcohol syndrome. So, this is associated with excessive uses of alcohol while pregnant. So, we're not talking about one glass of wine here or there. We're talking about, mom possibly getting drunk multiple times throughout the pregnancy. And fetal alcohol syndrome is associated with things like deficits in IQ, lowering the rate at which infants react to things. So it actually affects how they can react to certain stimuli in their environment. We've seen deficits in motor skills, so being able to move around, deficits in their attention span, their math skills, and so on and so forth. So, alcohol can definitely affect a fetus while mom is pregnant. And this is just so you can see what a normal, healthy infant brain looks like, which is on the left. and what a brain looks like of an infant who has fetal alcohol syndrome. So as you can see, this is a drastic difference, and this greatly affects infants' development. And just a few more environmental factors to consider. The immune system of a fetus matures relatively late in the prenatal period. So, typically not until 2 or 3 months of gestation. So, they are especially susceptible to any infections that mom may have before their immune system is developed. And even once they're born, their immune system isn't that great, right? So, that's one reason that doctors do encourage breastfeeding if you're able to or if you want to. It is a mom's choice to do, breastfeeding or formula. But one benefit of breast milk is that it passes on mom's immunities to the baby. So while their immune system is still growing and developing, they have this sort of added protection that comes from mom by absorbing the immunities through the breast milk. The placenta does filter out a number of infectious agents, but not all of them. So I remember when I was pregnant with my daughter, same one that was giving me all the trouble, I couldn't eat. The swine flu was also a really big deal around that time, right? So a lot of people were getting very, very sick. And they had just come out with a vaccine for the swine flu when I was about 6 months pregnant with her. And one of the sort of big deals that was going on around swine flu was that typically, if a pregnant woman got the swine flu, they would most likely be okay. They would probably get very ill, but they would be okay. But more likely than not, the fetus would not survive. So the virus was such that it actually detrimentally attacked or affected the fetus and would result in a miscarriage. So this was quite scary, being pregnant and knowing that this virus was out there. So I remember getting the vaccine while I was pregnant, which is also really scary, right? Typically, they don't want you getting vaccinated while you're pregnant. They don't really want you doing anything new or introducing anything new to the body if you can help it. But because that strain of flu was especially detrimental to a fetus, the placenta really could not keep that infection away from them. So even if mom survived and mom was fine, the placenta was not strong enough to protect the fetus from that virus, and they probably wouldn't make it. So even though that placenta does lend some sort of protection, a certain level of protection to the fetus, it can protect from everything. And finally, research has suggested that some fetuses exposed to environmental toxins while in the womb have also showed impairments of cognitive development. Um, Now, don't get too worried about all of these things, right? There are so many things. And I think, when you do get pregnant, or if you're thinking about having children, or someone who's pregnant, they get inundated with all of this information and all the things that can go wrong. So if you're pregnant or planning on becoming so, or you have a friend is, please don't panic. A vast majority of births do continue on successfully and they have healthy babies. Babies are actually very resilient. So even if they're born with a few setbacks, they fight hard. Um, and many births are carried out with little to no difficulties. So just keep that in mind. But these are just some of the environmental factors that we have to think about when we're looking at the development of humans as a whole, right? Because a lot of that development does take place before you're even born. Okay, so now we're going to talk about motor development. So, this is the progression of muscular coordination that's required for physical activities. When babies are first born, they're pretty much helpless, right? They can't move around a whole lot. Their movements are very jerky and not purposeful. They can't hold their head up, and so on and so forth. But this very quickly changes. And in fact, the motor development of an infant grows at an alarming rate over the first year of life. If you look at a 1-year-old and look at a newborn infant, it's kind of amazing. the progression and the growth that happens in just 1 year. They go from being this sort of helpless little blob. They cannot do anything for themselves. They can hardly move their body around, to being this little person who has a voice and is typically walking around and moving things around, and you're chasing them and trying to get control of the 1 year old, right? So it's pretty amazing how much growth and development happens in just the first year. And there are a few principles that are apparent in motor development of an infant. So, first is the cephalocaudal trend. This refers to the fact that infants first gain control of their upper bodies before they gain control of their lower bodies, right? So think about all the things a baby can do before they walk. Typically, they army crawl across the floor, sometimes they roll around. And these things largely involve their arms and torso rather than their legs, right? You don't typically have infants who are walking or gain control of their legs until much later, usually around a year or even after that. So if you have children or if you've ever been around children, you've seen this. But when babies roll over, they typically do so with just their arms and upper body at first. And a lot of them kind of get stuck halfway, right? So they can get their shoulder and their arms turn, their torso, but those legs just kind of get dragged behind them. And it's not until they have enough strength to essentially drag their legs over that they're able to turn over. But they don't have control of their legs until much later in their development. And then we have the proximate distal trend. So this refers to the fact that children gain control of their torsos before their extremities. And you also see this with infants, especially if you lay them on their stomach. They can kind of like arch their back a little bit. They try to lift their head up and they arch their back and kind of their shoulder area. They sort of rock back and forth in this rocking motion on their stomach, but their arms and legs just kind of lay there, or they kind of flail in a very unuseful way, right? So it takes them a while before they even realize they can use their arms and legs to better help them move around. It's a pretty funny thing when a child realizes that that leg they've been, the foot, they often bring their foot up to their mouth and chew on it, when they realize that that foot is attached to their body and they can actually use it. It's pretty comical. But up until that point, they just have control of their torso muscles and the extremities, the limbs, not so much control over those. And motor development really depends on a couple of things. So, first, it relies on physical growth. So, if the child isn't growing or getting bigger, they won't be able to engage in these muscular movements, right? They have to get bigger and stronger to be able to move. It also depends on maturation. So, this refers to one's genetic blueprint. So, as we age, your genetic blueprint is going to unfold. If you have taller parents, you're probably going to be a taller child. And so maybe you'll have, faster acquisition of gaining control of like your limbs or, your legs and things like that. So as you mature genetically, that will also change how you develop in your motor development, right? And as the infant, of course, begins to explore and interact with their environment, their motor development also increases from exposure, right? From learning how to interact with their environment. So here are the typical ages of when these major motor milestones occur. Now, of course, this differs between children. Some are earlier, some develop later, but this is just the average ages at which these milestones typically occur. So starting around 2 months until the age of 5 months, infants begin following movements with their eyes. This is when maybe they'll follow mom if mom's walking around the room, or if you have a rattle and you sort of do this in front of their face, they'll follow the object. They also begin to lift their head when they're laid on their stomach. So you will often hear parents refer to this as tummy time, right? Where they make the infant lay on their stomach. The infant typically doesn't like it, especially at first when they can't figure out how to lift their head off the floor. But during this time of development, they are able to have the strength to lift their head up, right, during tummy time. They can also hold their head steady on their own without having to support it from someone who's holding them. And you can place objects in their hands and they'll grasp it, right? So they'll hang on to it. Then, around 6 to 9 months, infants will start to roll over and sit up on their own. So, again, they gain more control over their upper body to do those things. Because remember, typically upper body strength and control comes first in development, and then the control over their legs comes last. In this stage, the 6 to 9 months, they're also able to pick up smaller things as their pincher grasp develops. So, this is when instead of just grasping things with their whole hand in like a fist like gesture, now they can use thumb and fingers, right, to pick things up. So, they can pick up tiny things off the floor. This is when you really have to watch your infant because they try to put everything in their mouth, right? Because now they can pick up all those little tiny pieces. And typically by the end of this stage, infants also start crawling. Now, some do it a little earlier, some do it a little later, but this is the average age at which crawling occurs. Then, from 10 to 12 months, infants start pulling themselves to a standing position and using objects to balance and walk around. We call this cruising, right? So, this is when a child maybe pulls themselves up to stand by a couch and then they sort of scoot along the couch, right? They walk around one side of the couch, they walk around the other side of the couch, and they're hanging onto the couch. They're using it for balance, but they are standing upright on their leg and sort of moving around whatever they're using for balance. Some infants even begin walking during this stage. So, again, depending on the development of their genetic makeup, some kids are bigger, their legs are stronger, they're able to walk at this stage. Some walk as early as 9 to 10 months, but a lot of children, it's after their 1 year birthday is when they start walking. So by the 13 to 18 months, that's where a majority of the infants begin walking if they weren't already doing so. And at this point, they can also hold like a crayon or a pen, a marker, a pencil, anything they can use to scribble. So their pincher grasp is developing as well at this point, so they can hold a pen and they scribble. So they don't have any of those fine motor skills where they're like coloring in the lines and things like that, but they could scribble if you give them, a pencil or a crayon or something. They can also point. So, this is when you see a lot of young children pointing at everyone and everything, right? So, they can point to pictures, they can point to objects when they're asked to, and they can also hold and throw objects while they're standing balanced. So, if you see children before this stage, they might be able to stand up, but the second they try to pick anything up or they try to throw something or reach for something, they often fall over, right? Their balance isn't really there yet. But when they get to this final stage of development at 13 to 18 months, they can manipulate other objects and still maintain their balance. So that's another thing that happens in the development during this stage. Let's talk about parenting styles. So, of course, a big part of a child's environment is their parents and caregivers, right? These are the people the child sees on a daily basis and most likely interacts with the most, right? They probably spend their most time with these people. And parenting style or the practices that are used in raising a child are critical in shaping that child's social competence. So, how they're going to interact socially with their world is influenced by parenting style. It's a highly influential variable on a child's development. And there are four separate categories, and we'll go through the different parenting styles in just a moment, but each of them tend to produce different kinds of behavior in children. Now, there are many exceptions to this. Children overcome negative parenting situations all of the time. So it's not to say that this is concrete information. These are just sort of the averages and what we typically see, but there are always exceptions to every rule, right? So keep that in mind. These are just the overall picture of what the parenting style is and the results that they can have on the children being raised in those environments. And keep in mind also that all of the ones we're going to go through are child rearing practices that are most similar to what is happening here in the US. Okay, so it really represents parenting in the United States. There's a high value placed on independence. right? We all move out of our parents when we're very young. When we're babies, right, there's an emphasis on making your child sleep in their own room, in their own crib, not in your bed, right? No co-sleeping. um, that's very different from the parenting styles that are in other cultures where they actually value dependence to a certain extent, a lot more than we do. They do co-sleeping. Some families will sleep in the same room for years. Some children don't move out of their home until they get married, so they'll stay well into adulthood with their parents, and so on and so forth. So keep in mind that the parenting styles we're talking about are specific to our own culture here in the United States. Okay. These might look different in other cultures. Okay. So the first parenting style we have is authoritarian. So this is a very rigid, strict parenting style. These parents typically require immediate obedience without question. Disagreement of any kind on the part of the child isn't tolerated, right? Army parents are usually looked at as authoritarians, where you do it because mom and dad said so, right? There's no reasoning why you have to do something other than I'm the parent and I said so. So it's very rigid and strict. And this often produces children who are typically unsociable, unfriendly, and for the most part withdrawn from others, which makes sense if you sort of think about it, if you reason it out. Their voice and their opinion is not allowed, right? So when their parents say to do something, they have to do it without questioning. They don't get an opinion on it. So then when they need to interact with socially with other people, especially when they're very young, they're not very sociable, right? Because at home, if they don't have a voice, then when they go out and interact with others, they're probably going to feel like they don't have a voice there either. So that's what that parenting style produces. Then we have what is called the permissive parenting style. So these parents have a very laissez faire type attitude when it comes to parenting their children, right? They're not demanding. They don't typically require much of the child. They give them the choice, but they don't force them, right? It's the child's choice. Um, not to say that this is a bad way of parenting, but, and it's, especially from a child's perspective, it probably looks great, right? It sounds great. But when we look at the long term effects of the child's social development, this type of parenting is not in the best interest of the child. So even though maybe it feels like you're trying to give them independence and instill that in them, what this actually produces is more immature and moody children, and are often very dependent on their caregivers because things are done for them more often than not. Children don't want to do things they don't want to do. I have two kids. They don't want to pick up their toys. They don't want to do their homework. They don't want to help me clean up after dinner or help me make dinner. Those aren't things that they are born wanting to do. I have to teach them that they're things they have to do anyways, um, rather than doing it all for them. So my children, they're 6 and 10. And I'll talk about the authoritative parenting in just a moment. And that's typically how I parent my children. Every now and then, I suppose I will tell them, you're just going to do this because I said so. But for the most part, we have a discussion. My children debate with me a lot. I like to call it debating and not arguing. Sometimes we cross lines, but I give them the freedom to express their opinion and their dislikes about things. And I say, thank you for telling me that, but you still need to do this. And I'm going to do it with you. And here's why we're going to do this, and so on and so forth. But parents who do the permissive parenting might say something like, well, I need you to clean your room, but if you don't want to, it's okay. And then maybe they'll even go behind their kid and be like, well, you didn't have to because they didn't, and they'll clean the room for them, right? So it actually produces children who are very dependent on their caregivers because they've had everything done for them. And they often demonstrate low self control because they're typically permitted to do whatever they want. They haven't learned to have self control because, they're permitted to do anything. Then we have the authoritative parenting style. So the word itself sounds similar to authoritarian, and maybe parts of it also sound similar, but they're very different, in fact. So these parents set firm limits and goals for the child. They give them boundaries of what is expected and what is not, right? So this is already different from the authoritarian, where a child is told, you just do this because I said so. But with authoritative parenting, reasoning is used. So even though you might still require the child to complete a task that they don't want to or that you're asking of them, you're going to explain to them why it is you're doing that, the reason behind your demand. Um, I My son, who's 6, he asks the question why about 100 times a day. And I try really hard to have patience and answer him because I have to remind myself that this is his first time through life. I, as a 30 something year old woman, I know the why of why I'm asking him to do it, but that's because I have grown up and experienced this myself. And now, as a parent, I'm experiencing it again. So I know why. But as a 6-year old child, he doesn't. So when I say we need to unload the dishwasher and he says, well, why? I think a lot of people look at that and say, well, he's arguing with you, he's being disobedient. And I say, no, he genuinely not wants to know why, because in his 6-year-old little mind, he doesn't understand why we have to get the dishes out of the dishwasher and put them away. Like, why would we do that? That's not fun. I don't want to do that. So I have to explain to him if we don't do that, then all the dirty dishes pile up in the sink and then they get smelly and then we have no clean dishes. And how would we eat our food? And more often than not, I would say about 95% of the time, he goes, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And he goes and does it, right? He's genuinely asking a question. And authoritative parenting allows for that, whereas authoritarian parenting does not. So that's the difference in terms of they both have strict demands on their children. They have expectations, but it's the way those expectations are implemented on the child. And this type of parenting does encourage and result in independence quite often, because they're required to learn to do things on their own, right? They have to learn how to succeed on their own. Their parents don't do that for them. So they typically have fairly good social skills. They're reliable and independent individuals as they grow into adulthood. And finally, we have the uninvolved parenting style. Now, these parents are detached emotionally from their children. It's very sad if you have been in this situation or seen this situation ever, but these parents just provide the basic needs. So they provide food, clothing, and shelter, but they really don't care about the child's behavior or where they are or what they're doing at all. And this typically results in children who are indifferent towards other people. They often reject anyone else who would try to reach out and help them because, from the child's perspective, they have had to depend on their own selves their whole lives. They were given their bare basic needs, and everything else they had to deal with on their own. So they're really indifferent and reject other people. That's typically what we see. Now, remember, after going through all these, like I said, these are just the typically what we see, right? The averages, but there's exceptions to every rule. There are children who come out of uninvolved parenting styles who succeed in life and they learn how to socialize with their peers and they do just fine. So remember that these are not the end all be all, it's just what we see for the most part. Now, the way in which caregivers parent their children can also affect types of attachment that the child has to the caregiver. So, attachment refers to the positive emotional bond that develops between a child and a particular individual, whoever that is that's raising the child, right? So, whether that be their parents or grandparents, their aunt and uncle, whoever the primary caregiver is. So, that's what we're talking about when we say attachment. And this attachment is considered to be the most important form of social development that occurs during infancy. So you want to see attachment of the infant to their caregiver. And then we also have something called separation anxiety, which is emotional distress that is seen in infants who are separated from the person that they formed the attachment with. So there are different levels of attachment and different levels of separation anxiety that can be exhibited depending on the parenting style and the relationship that has formed between the infant and the parent. So let's look at a couple of theories of attachment that have been looked at over the years. So, first is Harry Harlow. So, he conducted a fairly well known study with infant monkeys, and you see a picture of them there. There's a little monkey in the experiment. So in these experiments, he removed baby monkeys from their mother at birth, which is, quite sad. But basically, he took these babies and he raised them in a lab. And he did so with two different kinds of substitute, quote unquote, mothers, right? So the first was a wire mother, and you can see from this picture, it's just like a little round metal wire cage with a milk bottle at the top of it, right? So this mother, it was cold metal, but it provided milk, okay? And the second mother was a cloth mother, and it was wrapped in a soft, warm towel. And for half of the monkeys who were raised by the cloth mother, they also received milk from her, but half of the monkeys did not receive milk. So the reason he did this, of course, is to vary which mother the monkeys were getting milk from. So some monkeys got milk from metal mother, and some monkeys got milk from the cloth mother. And then, if they were getting milk from one, they weren't getting milk from the other. But what he found was that regardless of whether the baby monkey received milk from the wire or the cloth mother, whenever they were with the two, so they would put them in a chamber with both the wire and the cloth mother next to each other. And whenever the baby monkey was frightened, all of the monkeys in all of the groups preferred and sought comfort from the warm cloth mother instead. So he concluded from a series of these studies that milk alone, which is a biological need, was not enough to create an attachment between the infant and the mother, right? So all of them chose the warmer, snugglier mom over the mom that may have given the milk. And that's a really important finding when we look at attachment between infants and their parents, because it doesn't only depend on if biological needs are met or not. And then we have Mary Ainsworth. She was a developmental psychologist who conducted the Ainsworth Strange Situation Study that many of you have probably heard about at one point or another, especially if you've taken a psychology course. So she conducted a study that assessed the quality of the attachment between young children and their primary caregiver, whoever that was. So it was moms for some and dads for others. And what she did was she put the child through a procedure that exposed them to short separations and reunions to their caregivers. So essentially, the caregiver would bring the child into the room, they would play with them for a few minutes, and then they would leave for a short time. And then after a few minutes, the caregiver would come back into the room. And what Mary Ainsworth was looking at was how the children responded both when the caregiver left the room and when the caregiver came back. And from these observations, from observing the child in both of these situations, she identified 4 different patterns of attachment. So the first degree of attachment is what she called secure attachment. And she observed this with the majority of the infants that were in her studies. So for this level of attachment, the child plays and explores the room comfortably, meaning with no reservations. So as long as the caregiver is present, so mom brings child into this new room where they've never been before, and child feels pretty comfortable exploring the room, playing with the toys that are there, as long as mom is there, right? As long as they can see mom, they're okay. Um, and then the caregiver leaves. So mom gets up and leaves, close the door, and the infant can no longer see her. And at this point, in a secure attachment, the infants become visibly upset, right? They're crying. They might crawl towards the door. They're very upset. But when mom comes back, they calm down very quickly and easily. So mom comes back, picks them up, they calm down, and then they go off and play again. Okay, so that's the secure attachment, and that is what she saw with the majority of the infants she worked with. Then she saw something called the avoidance attachment. So for this, she observed infants not really caring one way or the other if the caregiver was in the room. So they didn't gravitate towards the caregiver when they were present, or if they returned after an absence. The child would just kind of observe them, but no real deference as to whether or not their parents were there. And also, most of these infants were equally comfortable with the experimenter who was a stranger as they were with their own caregiver. So that's what she saw with avoidant attachment. Comfortable with strangers, not really caring if mom was there or not. Then we have ambivalent attachment. For these children, they displayed anxiety before the caregiver left. So they actually were not exploring the room. They sort of stick to the caregiver, and they're visibly unsure of the environment that they've been placed in, right? So, not like the secure attachment children who were exploring and playing. These children stuck pretty close to the caregiver and already sort of looked upset before mom had even left. Then, when mom leaves or the caregiver leaves, the child became increasingly upset. And when the caregiver returns, even though the children did seek some sort of contact, they may also lash out at their caregivers. So they might hit them or kick them, but they don't just go towards the caregiver, um, to get in close contact with them. They may also act in this sort of ambivalent way of like hitting them or kicking them. And finally, we have the disorganized or disoriented attachment. And this is where children often show very inconsistent or contradictory behavior. So they might approach the caregiver, but they don't really make eye contact with them. Or they might, just act in really odd, inappropriate ways. So they kind of wander around the room, not really sure what to do or who to look at, or they freeze. So they don't really move. They seem very confused. And this happens both when they're in the room with mom and when mom comes back. So this is what we call disorganized or disoriented attachment. And this concludes the first portion of our lifespan development talk.